everyone. Sorry I can't be in Auckland. I've always dreamt of going to New Zealand, but here we are. So I'll just be delivering my paper virtually and dreaming of being in Auckland. Okay. In 1890, in the French town of Béziers, a so-called carnival hypnotizer introduced a young girl, one Miss Sperling, into a cage with a live adult lion. The hypnotist's goal was to demonstrate to the gathered crowd how profound and authentic her hypnotic trance was. So profound that she would neither protest nor fear when introduced into the cage. Ignoring the fact that the subject of an earlier hypnotism show had been seriously mauled by a lion, the man proceeded with the demonstration. It did not go well. Spectators watched in horror as the lion seized Miss Sperling in its jaws and carried her around the cage. Eventually, she was extracted from the lion's mouth and taken to a hospital. She died shortly thereafter. The tragedy in Béziers overlapped with another dramatic tale involving hypnotism. This one unfolded in the courtrooms of Paris. For 18 months, between 1889 and 1891, the lurid case of the accused murderer, Gabrielle Bompard, dominated newspaper headlines. According to the reports, the young Bompard, along with her older lover, Michel Hérault, had conspired to strangle and rob an affluent Parisian bailiff whose decayed body had been found outside of Lyon. The prosecution claimed that Bompard and Hérault had arranged a sexual rendezvous between Bompard and the victim with the intent of robbing and then murdering him. Articles and trial testimony reveled in the sordid details of the case. Bompard's past abuse at the hands of nuns, teachers, and her own father, a well-to-do businessman, her apparent lasciviousness, which manifested itself in serial love affairs, her romantic and eventually criminal relationship with the unscrupulous Hérault, the eroticism of the final assault on the bailiff, and her dramatic displays of irrational behavior upon her return to France and while in prison. But what elevated the case above standard sensational fare was the question of Bompard's responsibility for her own actions. Doctors and other expert witnesses debated whether Bompard, a young woman whose mental and psychological health was questionable at best, had conscious control of her alleged criminal behavior. The star witness for the defense was Jules Liégeois, a law professor from Nancy with a strong interest in the criminal risks of hypnotism. Setting aside the question of Bompard's fundamental moral character, Liégeois argued that only hypnotic suggestion could account for her behavior. How do you explain her undeniable ties to a man whom she obeys like a dog? Liégeois offered a lengthy description of experiments that he himself had conducted, complete with photos and lab notes, in which hypnotized subjects had been made to commit staged hypothetical crimes ranging from bearing false witness to theft and even to murder. Remember, he stressed, hypnotic suggestions can be issued days, weeks, or even months before the crime, and worst of all, the subject might not even be aware of having been hypnotized or having received the suggestion. The incredulous general prosecutor asked Liégeois, "Are you saying that a suggestible subject puts herself in harm's way if she does something as innocent as travel alone by train?" "Exactly," replied Liégeois. "Someone like Bompard," he warned, "could be controlled by a gesture as commonplace as a hard stare." Liégeois was not even deterred by Bompard's own statement that Hérault had never hypnotized her. After all, Liégeois maintained Hérault may well have commanded her not to remember. But Liégeois was not the only witness on hypnosis to testify. Paul Brouardel, a well-known physician with a special interest in legal medicine, warned that one must proceed with extreme caution when confronted with a claim of innocence by reason of hypnotic suggestion. All too often, he warned, the accused was never actually hypnotized and in many cases could not be hypnotized. A more likely explanation for Bompard's behavior, he contended, lay in the far more commonplace situation wherein one person in a relationship exhibits excessive control over the other. Bompard, he concluded, should be held responsible for her actions. Eventually, the court backed the prosecution and decided that the question of whether Bompard had been under the influence of hypnotic suggestion was irrelevant. Citing explicitly the work of Jean-Martin Charcot, the world's best-known expert on hypnosis, the prosecutor general concluded that hypnotism could never overcome an individual's core convictions or alter her fundamental character and personality. The prosecutor feared that allowing hypnotism to serve as a defense against criminal liability could potentially undermine the entire justice system. Quote, "If hypnotism a little understood phenomenon is allowed to triumph here, he concluded, it will mean the negation of free will, of human freedom, and in the future, we will not be able to hold assassins responsible for human life, end quote. Allowing that Bompard probably suffered from mental illness, a consideration that resulted in a reduction of her sentence, the court nonetheless judged that her crime was the product of her own flawed moral character. The Bompard and Sperling episodes, in many ways, could not have been more different. Sperling was presented as the innocent, ignorant victim, duped by a charlatan, a popular hypnotizer with no scruples about exploiting and abusing his subject. Her role in the tragedy was utterly passive. The fact that she had been hypnotized was not in question. She was no more responsible for her fate than a person attacked in her bed while sleeping. To those seeking to regulate the practice of hypnotism, she represented the danger faced by ordinary people, especially women, in a world where malicious mind controllers traveled the continent preying on a credulous, curious populace eager to participate in the latest entertainment. Bompard's image was more complicated. Her defenders cast her as the innocent victim of a scheming lover who controlled her through hypnotic suggestion, much like Miss Sperling, but her accusers argued that she was fully complicit in the crime, and her defenders were simply exploiting the hypnotism craze in order to literally let her get away with murder. Though she may have been mentally ill, her will remained her own. Hypnotism was besides the point, since the will could not be completely destroyed, even by the most susceptible subject. Behind both these cases was uncertainty about what hypnotism in fact was. For Charcot, Rudé, and others whose work centered around the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, susceptibility to hypnotism and hypnotic suggestion was a symptom of underlying hysteria, a sign of neurotic pathology. To others, in particular a group of doctors centered around the physician Hippolyte Bernheim in Nancy, hypnotic sleep was not qualitatively different from normal sleep, and all people were, to one degree or another, vulnerable to suggestion. For Charcot and the so-called Salpêtrière school, then, the need to regulate the practice of hypnotism stemmed from a belief that there were people with latent hysteria whose pathology could be triggered by exposure to hypnotism outside of a medical setting. For the Nancy school, the normal human susceptibility to hypnotic suggestion was not pathological and in fact could be put to positive use for behavior modification, pain relief, and even as a form of anesthesia. Yet the normality and implied ubiquity of hypnotic suggestion was also potentially alarming. If everyone is suggestible, then what becomes of the autonomous will? Over the course of the 1880s and 1890s, public, legal, and medical interest in hypnotism skyrocketed across Europe. Although Franz-Antoine Mesmer had drawn huge crowds with his demonstrations of the mysterious powers of animal magnetism in the late 18th century, condemnation by various professional medical societies in the early 19th century had pushed the practice outside of the bounds of scientific discourse. By mid-century, however, increased numbers of reputable men of science grew interested in the subject and lent it a modicum of legitimacy. It once again gained popularity. Capitalizing on rejuvenated interest in the once marginal subject, self-taught magnetists traveled from town to town with their hypnotism shows. Before crowds of sometimes hundreds of onlookers, they produced spectacles like the one with poor Miss Sperling, that often involved experienced and paid hypnotic subjects, but also attracted curious or sensation-seeking volunteers from the audience. The Danish magnetist Carl Hansen drew huge crowds in Scandinavia, Russia, Britain, Austria, and especially Germany, while the Belgian Donato, the stage name of Alfred Dont, performed to sold-out theaters across France, Italy, and Switzerland, as well as the United States. While these shows continued to draw crowds, much of the medical community excoriated the magnetizers for endangering the public and encroaching on the territory of medical professionals. Hypnotism, they argued, was a powerful and legitimate therapeutic and diagnostic technique, but only when deployed by doctors. The potential for amateur hypnotism to aid in the perpetration of crime elicited the most ominous warnings and predictions from doctors anxious to keep the practice out of the hands of the general public. Possible crimes that could be committed ranged from legal and financial fraud, as Liégeois suggested in the Bompard trial, to perjury and theft, and to rape and murder. Women stood at the center of the discourse on the dangers of hypnotism. The gruesome incident in the busy Alliance cage was only the latest in a series of episodes in which women were cast as the victims of hypnotizers. Critics, most of whom were doctors, repeatedly brought up cases from the past to show that women were especially vulnerable to the evil effects of hypnotic suggestion. In one particularly horrifying, well-publicized, and oft-recounted case from 1865, a vagrant named Salon allegedly hypnotized a young girl and repeatedly raped her while she was under his power. Although she eventually managed to escape and Salon was later convicted and condemned to 12 years of forced labor, Josephine, the victim, quote, never returned to full reason. Perpetrators of hypnotically induced crimes were not limited to marginal members of society like Salon. Perhaps the most famous such case involved a magnetizer turned dentist named Dr. Levy, who, according to Brouardel, quote, did not hesitate to rape a hypnotized, unfortunate young girl who had come to him seeking help, end quote. Levy was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and the girl gave birth to a stillborn child after 7 months pregnancy. By the late 1880s and 1890s, the potential for hypnotism to abet a crime elicited a drumbeat of ominous warnings and predictions from doctors. Georges Gilles de la Tourette, a student of Charcot's and the most outspoken advocate of restricting popular hypnotism, warned in 1886 that, quote, in criminal or at least unscrupulous hands, hypnotism can become a dangerous weapon, as dangerous for the body as for the morality of hypnotized individuals, end quote. Ironically, however, these very doctors were in large part responsible for the enormous surge in hypnotic practice, popular and medical alike. Doctors in late 19th century France welcomed broad interest in their work and frequently opened their lecture halls to members of the curious public. Hysteria and hypnosis were particularly popular topics, and hospitals regularly hosted sessions by physicians who demonstrated in dramatic fashion the effects of hypnotism on patients in their clinics. By 1890, the practice had become so widespread in Paris that a city councillor complained to the hospital administrators that, quote, it is common to see politicians, journalists, and actors in hospitals conducting experiments in somnambulism, which was the suggestible stage of the hypnotic trance. And although this image that you see here looks like it's a clinical demonstration for doctors, which it was in part, the audience here includes 2 writers and an art critic, as well as a politician. And no one bore more responsibility for introducing the public to the practice of scientific hypnotism than Charcot. Charcot conducted innumerable experimental hypnosis demonstrations at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris. His goal was to artificially induce the symptoms of hysteria, thereby, he hoped, gaining insight into the mysterious origins of the disease and potentially to find a cure for it. Women drawn from among the many long-term residents of the hospital were brought into his amphitheater. Once hypnotized, they would perform actions on command. A patient might shrink in horror when told that a string was a snake, or bend down smiling to pick invisible flowers, or stroke a non-existent cat that she was told was purring in her arms. In a more alarming experiment, a hypnotized young woman was instructed while in a trance that the paper knife placed in her hand was a dagger and that she must murder a particular individual in the room. On awakening, 2 observing doctors recalled the patient hovered around her victim and suddenly strikes him, and with such violence that I think it well to refrain from such experiments. In another demonstration, the most famous of Charcot's hysteria patients, Blanche Whitman, was commanded while hypnotized to poison the novelist and theater director Jules Clarité, who, along with other members of the cultural elite, frequently attended the Salpêtrière sessions. With charming good grace and an adorably perfidious feminine smile, Clarité recalled, the poor unconscious woman offered me the glass she believed to be poisoned. These types of demonstrations became popular attractions themselves. Sarah Bernhardt allegedly attended them, as did the philosopher Hippolyte Taine, the writer Guy de Maupassant, and the sociologist Gabriel Tarre, among others. Hypnotism became the subject of novels, serialized stories, and plays. For many doctors, including Charcot, the serious criminal potential of unregulated hypnotism was more hypothetical than real, and the more ominous threat was not to law and order, but to public health. Popular magnetizers with neither medical nor scientific mandate, they argued, and motivated only by the pursuit of money, could inadvertently bring about nervous breakdowns and mass hysteria among audiences and whole villages unaware of the powers of hypnosis. On several occasions, Charcot found himself in the position of attempting to undo the damage caused by non-medical magnetizers. Doctors complained that public displays of so-called magnetism frequently resulted in outbreaks of hysterical fits and hysterical paralysis, not just among participants and direct targets, but among onlookers as well. Today, we know perfectly well that the popular spread of hypnotism can be followed, Charcot wrote, even for those merely in attendance, by accidents either immediately or in the long term, accidents that are quite serious when they are not grave. The Revue de Hypnotisme warned in 1890 that popular hypnotists posed an imminent danger to society because, quote, they are frequently the starting point of a nervous contagion whose effects are harmful, and because we consider it an affront to human dignity to make a show of individuals who are deprived temporarily of their free will, end quote. By the late 1880s, the problem of unregulated popular hypnotism was widely regarded in Europe as a public health threat. The internationally renowned Donato had his performance permit revoked in Milan in 1887, and in Bologna, theater owners were forbidden to rent to him. In 1888, Austria, Italy, Denmark, Germany, Spain, Portugal, and most Swiss cantons had outlawed all public demonstrations by hypnotists, and shortly thereafter, the Belgian government followed suit. By 1890, England too had prohibited the practice of hypnotism unless it had a, quote, scientific objective. And by 1891, hypnotism could be practiced in Russia only in the presence of 3 doctors. In France, the story was a bit different from the rest of Europe. There, doctors and other proponents of regulation encountered resistance. Although the Society of Legal Medicine voted in 1886 to create a commission on the regulation of hypnotism, no action was taken on a national level. Only the city of Bordeaux outlawed public exhibition of magnetism in response to the, quote, veritable epidemic of hypnotic insanity, end quote, and the attempted suicide of one participant precipitated by a visit by Donato in 1888. On April 3rd of 1888, the section of hygiene and public medicine of the French Association of the Advancement of Sciences voted, quote, that public displays of magnetism and hypnotism should be forbidden throughout French territory, and that the use of hypnotism and magnetism as curative measure should submit to the laws that regulate the practice of medicine, end quote. But the measure languished in French Parliament. By the end of 1889, Georges Gilles de la Tourette lamented that, quote, our country has thus become the refuge of all the entertainer magnetizers whose posters cover the walls of the capital, end quote. Thwarted in their effort to curb popular hypnotism directly, the French medical profession tried another approach. In 1892, the government passed a revised law on the practice of medicine, which mandated that only licensed doctors, midwives, and dentists could practice their respective professions, and laid out penalties for those who violated the code. But this fortification of professional boundaries made no specific mention of hypnotism. That absence made it possible for popular hypnotizers to continue to thrive. The law did have some impact. Going forward, popular magnetizers were, for the most part, careful to avoid claims that they offered medical treatment. Nonetheless, lay hypnotists continued to ply their trade to enthusiastic audiences in theaters throughout the country and well into the next century. Donato himself was still touring theaters in France in 1924. But the desire to police the borders of professional medical practice was not the only reason that doctors and medical and sympathetic legislators sought to regulate hypnotism. For Charcot and many of his colleagues, regulating hypnotism was also part of their ongoing effort to combat the misdefined forces of religion, superstition, and occultism. To them, popular as opposed to scientific hypnotism arose from the same cultural impulses that made seances, speaking with the dead, automated writing, and spiritualist pursuits of all kinds so pervasive in the closing decades of the 19th century. It was the product of the same forces that stimulated a marked increase in reported miraculous sightings of the Virgin Mary and the establishment of shrines with mysterious healing powers. Popular hypnotism was, in short, a dangerous display of unreason. By claiming it for scientific medicine, and attempting to confine it within the law, they sought to shore up the domain of reason and order against what they perceived as the disorderly, potentially chaotic forces of emotions and the unconscious. In the end, then, the story of the girl in the lion cage and the numerous other sensational accounts of hypnotism gone awry expressed both excitement and trepidation surrounding the acute awareness that the mind was not entirely, or even perhaps primarily, an instrument of reason. The ambivalent French response, on the one hand, loud calls for regulation by many doctors and legal experts, and on the other, unwillingness on the part of the government to take definitive action, reflected broader anxieties about the powerful changes that marked the decades surrounding the turn of the 20th century, changes that suggested that the positivist science that most doctors held dear might not triumph in the end. This was, after all, a France that had barely survived the chaos of the Franco-Prussian War and the violent destruction of the Paris Commune that arose in its wake. It was a France whose Republican government had nearly succumbed to an autocratic, charismatic military general. It was a France divided between clerical backers of the church and anti-clerical promoters of positivism. The threat presented by hypnotism should, I think, be understood simultaneously as a professional response to a perceived real public health threat, as an expression of anxiety about the powers of the mind that were only beginning to be explored, and by the rapid social, political, and cultural changes that marked the last decades of the 19th century. This was the Belle Epoque, but beneath the elegant surface of an affluent, carefree society lay many uncertainties and potential dangers. Dangers that, like nervous weaknesses, could by accident or intention be brought to the fore.